I'm Greg.
And I'm Julie Gorman. And we're super excited to invite you to thrive in marriage. Over the next 10 sessions, we're going to share insights to help you claim the ideal marriage that you desire and the foundations that help to heal our relationship. You know, we have a great relationship today, but it wasn't always that way. As a matter of fact, the first couple years of marriage, we fought more often than we didn't. From my perspective, I'll just tell you kind of the junk that I brought into marriage. I was brought up in a family where every abuse was present. So physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. Lots of paradigms that I brought with me that were faulty. Add in a bunch of relationships that perpetuated that pain, and Greg had an uphill battle that he had to fight. So I was crazy, psychotic, jealous. I was convinced in my mind that much like everyone in my past, he was either going to hurt me or he was going to leave me. And so that caused a lot of what I would say healthy, well, maybe not so healthy, confrontations.
Robust confrontation.
Robust ones. I was pushing you in corners, and it really was unfair to him. So I would push him into corners through all my jealousy, all my insecurities, all the things that I wanted healing from but had no clue how to get the healing.
So let's let Julie take all the credit for our early perils in marriage. Let me speak up and tell you a little bit about my part. I also grew up in a pretty rough environment. I was kidnapped. I had just lots of crazy stuff that went on as a child. And I had never really seen or witnessed what a healthy relationship looked like and how a healthy marriage should be. And so I had a lot of anger issues. I sometimes thought that if we weren't fighting, something must be wrong. That, in other words, a healthy relationship, I should come in and maybe just start a fight every now and then, maybe assert my rights and draw some lines in the sand so that we can, get our blood flowing. I don't know what was going through my head, but the bottom line is that you can see with these two different personalities coming together under one roof, there were lots of room for sparks. I also had a flirtatious personality, which again, if you remember what Julie was telling you about her background, certainly didn't fly well. Now, it was a harmless flirt, but nonetheless, it didn't cater too well to some of the hurts and such that Julie brought with her.
So we knew something needed to change. We just weren't sure how to make that switch.
Yep.
Matthew 11:28 through 29 says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." I wasn't taking rest in Christ. I love Jesus, but I was trying to control my own universe. I was trying to create this world that Greg would be perfect in every way. I tried to control what he thought. I tried to control what he looked at. I tried to control what he watched or didn't watch. I thought he should think everything that I thought. So much so that I would push him in corners, as I shared earlier. And we would erupt in fights. And I remember one night in particular, the night that really began the change in us and the healing journey for us. We had had this huge confrontation. Now, I don't remember for the life of me what it was anymore.
Me neither.
But what I do remember is Greg speeding off in the SUV, slammed his door and his window was open. He said, "Julie, I love you, but I can't live like this." And I shouted at him, I'm like, "You can't leave. Neither one of us has been unfaithful." As if that was a reason for him to stay and the only reason for him to stay. And as he sped off, I remember crying out to the Lord. I walked back to our room, fell on my face, and I said, "God, I went through one divorce. I don't want to go through another. So change me, change him, do whatever it takes, but heal our marriage." And then I proceeded to give this long list of a sundry of things that God should change in you. And all the ways that Greg was wrong and I was right and God should intervene on my behalf. And God so gently interrupted and said, "Julie, would you let me change in you the things that need to be changed? And allow me to change in Greg what I think needs to be changed." And it was in that moment that I made a decision that I would entrust Greg to God. And I would allow God to be my defender. And I would allow God to change in me the things that needed to be changed. I would start to look for the things that I loved about Greg instead of all the ways that I thought were lacking. And I would choose to serve instead of expecting him to serve me.
It was a difficult season, but I remember that night very well. And it wasn't like everything changed in an instant, but it was the beginning of a season where we made a decision to be much more intentional. We knew we needed to change some things and begin this process really of surrendering and being much more intentional about working on our marriage. And for me, some of the things that I remember distinctly learning during that season was how to love Julie as my mate, as someone who I had vowed before God and man to love. I remember that I had spent a lot of time trying to cut her down to size and put her in her place. And like suddenly it dawned on me that makes no sense really for, again, the person that I vowed before God and man to love and cherish for eternity. What kind of silliness is that? I also remember coming to terms with my anger and how God really delivered me of my temper. But I had a move that I had to make first for God to be able to do that in my life. I had to want to release that anger. I grew up with this kind of owning that, I'm a Gorman, I'm Irish Indian. You don't want to mess with me, boy. You have your hands full, right? And that probably served me at one point in my life. But in my marriage relationship, and as we began to build a family, it certainly was something that no longer served me. And so it was a part of my identity that I had to let go because it no longer served me. And because I surrendered to God and allowed him to do that in my life, I was able to let go of that. And that was a huge, huge marker in our relationship to begin to move forward.
So the invitation that night was an invitation that truly provides the secret for every thriving marriage. The key to experiencing a thriving marriage is our complete surrender to God, a surrender of our fears and our future.
So let's unpack that word surrender for just a second and what that really means. One of the definitions that we found says that surrender means to defer to someone else. In this case, God. To defer to God. So it's important to remember that surrender is a lifestyle and it's a constant choice. In other words, it's not something that just happens all at once, at least not our surrender to God and in our relationship, right? Now, there's a reason why we pause and actually explain something that may be really elementary to you in this idea of surrender. Several years ago, when Julie and I first started teaching these messages, we had a couple who attended one of our conferences. You remember that?
I remember. Yep.
And we caught wind on the backside of a conversation that took place in their vehicle on the way home. And the guy took full advantage of this idea of surrender and was berating his wife on the way home, saying, "See, I told you, you just need to surrender. You just need to surrender to me." Now, there is a certain amount of surrender to one another that is necessary for a thriving, healthy marriage. But what we're talking about, more importantly, is a complete surrender to Christ and his will. After all, his will is to our best interest. It's to benefit us, not to hold us back or to be shackles, right? So we made an intentional decision ourselves to put our hope and our faith in God. That is an example of surrender. Lastly, surrender is an intentional decision to put our trust in God alone. Not that we can't trust ourselves or we can't trust our mate, but that ultimately our trust must reside singularly in Christ alone, who gives us the strength to surrender to begin with.
I like how Oswald Chambers said it. He said it this way: "If I put my trust in human beings first, I will end in despairing of everyone. I will become bitter because I've insisted on man being what no man can ever be." Absolutely right. Never trust anything but the grace of God in yourself or in anyone else.
That's so good.
You see, the more that I learned to trust God, the more I was able to release Greg from needing to be perfect. The more that I trusted God, the less that I expected Greg to be my hero. And I was able to receive the love that Greg gave for me because I wasn't expecting him to be perfect.
Absolutely true. It was good stuff. It was a pivotal season in our marriage. We really began to kind of put things together and get pointed back in the right direction. Now, the second truth to consider about surrender is what it does for us. Most of us are tuned into the station, the WIIFM. What's in it for me, right? So surrender in marriage does a couple of things. Number one, it exchanges our selfish nature for Christ's servant-like nature. And boy, that gives him a lot of room to do a whole bunch of work in us in our relationship. The second thing is when we do this, it allows our needs to be fully met in him so that we can embrace marriage as it was intended. Got to pause on that one for just a second. You know, a lot of us come into marriage thinking that her job's to meet my needs and that his job is to meet her needs. And it's absolutely not true. God's the only one who can meet our needs. And when we surrender completely and we allow him to take his rightful place in our life and meeting those needs, it really positions our mates in a place to where they don't have to be perfect. In other words, we're not expecting someone else to come into the marriage serving us to meet our needs and or complete us, as sometimes as this romantic idea. So keep that in mind. Lastly, it means surrendering our rights to God completely. It's non-negotiable. Like, in other words, we don't keep score anymore of whether she's meeting my needs or whether I'm meeting her needs. We just simply surrender all of our rights, just as Christ did. Now, that's a tall order, I understand that. But the more that we begin to embrace these ideas and be intentional about these things, the more that we notice that when we dropped the scoreboard, it wasn't a matter of who was ahead or who was serving who better. In fact, we eventually got to a place where it would be almost like a gentleman's battle where we were trying to outserve one another, right?
Yeah. I like that, Greg. You know, and you bring up an interesting point that surrender does come in stages. Surrender is not something that happens instantaneously, and that's okay, right? To embrace the process and realize, like Elizabeth Elliot said, one doesn't surrender a life in an instant. That which is lifelong can only be surrendered in a lifetime. And so as we began to embrace the concept of surrender, it didn't happen instantaneously. It wasn't something where all of a sudden it was like, okay, God, change in me the things that need to be changed and change in Greg. It was a day in, day out. And look, I'm married to a great guy, but there were times where it was minute by minute and second by second.
Yeah.
Where I had to rethink. I had brought in a lot of habits that I needed to break. I had perpetuated my pain trying to create this bubble-wrapped universe, and I had to unlearn how to do that. So in my mind, I made a conscious decision to love Greg. I made a conscious decision that when I started picking it up again, I was going to lay it back down. There were times where I talked to myself out loud and just said, stop, Julie, stop. And I would resurrender again and trust God again. And as I built this relationship found its healing.
I love that, babe. You know, I love what Charles Swindoll said. He said, a good marriage isn't so much about finding the right partner as it is being the right partner. And that starts with you. So take a few minutes to consider the following scriptures this week, provided in your handout. Write out the answers to the questions and share your responses with your spouse. And as you work through those responses, remember to focus on what you need to change and what you need to surrender, not what your spouse needs to change or what they need to surrender. There's only one person that you can change and grow, and that's yourself.
So as we close out this session, you know, one thing that I know, when we first started out doing devotionals together and reading and praying together, it felt really awkward.
Yep.
And so we've provided a lot of questions that you can put your mind to, some scriptures you can put your mind to, and even a closing prayer. So join us next week as we unpack another principle that saved our marriage.